It seems most of us are victims of over-advertising these days. Take this cutting board from Wayfair. Now, I've never shopped on Wayfair's website, and while I'm guessing I probably have searched for the word cutting board, it really appears that Wayfair wants me to check out this cutting board in particular. So I finally took the bait and clicked on it to check it out. Instantly I thought, hey, I can make this cutting board for a lot less. I made a few wood changes and some personal choices, but still ended up with a beautiful replica of the basic design. So, let's head into the shop and I'll show you how I made this cutting board for around 1/4 the cost of purchasing it through Wayfair's website. When I actually clicked on the link to the cutting board in question, I found that the price was $395. That's expensive for any cutting board in my book, but I will point out that their board is made with whinge, which is a more expensive exotic wood. So a lot of the price is wrapped up in that alone. However, just changing to walnut would give you a very close replication of the whinge in terms of color and richness. I, on the other hand, decided to go with a reverse replication and use hard maple for the main wood and walnut for the accent strips. I made this decision solely on the fact that it's what I had more of in stock at the time when making this video. However, even if I would have gone with walnut versus maple, the material cost between those two is still fairly close. I'm starting off with maple stock that's 18 inches long by 2 inches wide by 3/4 of an inch thick, and my walnut strips are about 1/8 of an inch thick. They're slightly longer and wider than my maple strips, but you'll see later that they'll cut them down to the same size. As I choose my stock, I'm looking for any imperfections that might find their way into the final product. You can see that a few of the maple boards have some imperfections, so I replace them with 2 other pieces of stock. I certainly don't want something like this rearing its ugly head at the end of the project. I then do the same for the walnut accent strips, and ultimately decide to replace 2 of those as well. Once I'm happy with the stock selection, we can begin. For the first process, I'm going to take 2 pieces of maple and sandwich a walnut strip between the 2. I will do this for all of my stock. One note here, the video starts with 5 glue-ups, but I later decided to add another one for 6 total, because I wanted a slightly wider board in the end. Before I glue up these sandwiches, as it were, I'm going to trim down the walnut strips to the same width as the maple strips. I lower my saw blade significantly to reduce the possibility of splitting and blade chatter. Once all the strips are cut, I take them to the clamps and start the glue up. Note that I'm not gluing all of the pieces together, but just one walnut strip between 2 pieces of maple. After a night of drying, the pieces are removed from the clamps and sent through the planer to remove any light surface glue and to true both surfaces. But before I do, I'll cut off the excess walnut from each piece. The planing process will also serve a second purpose as a way to begin squaring the pieces. Ultimately, the sandwich pieces will need to be as close to square as possible for the final pattern to work out correctly. Another way to true the surfaces can be achieved with a jointer, as shown here. When I get close to my final dimensions, I like to switch to the drum sander, as it allows me a lot more control in removing material over the planer and jointer. Once the pieces are square, I arrange them in an alternating pattern and glue all of the sandwich pieces together. After another night of drying, I'll run the slab or panel through the drum sander. I want to use the drum sander over the planer because I can really control the amount of material that is removed during a pass through the drum sander, and I definitely want minimal removal so as not to throw off the pattern. With the addition of my crosscut sled, I'm going to even up one side. Then, I'll start making measured cuts of 1 3/8 inches. When I get to my uncomfortable point with the crosscut sled, I switch over to the fence. Here's a nice quick tip. I use the last strip cut to set the precise fence location for the remaining cuts, as shown here. That's some pretty good math to end up with just that little bit of excess cutoff. As I assemble the panel for the final glue up, you'll see that I'm going to flip every other piece to create the same pattern as the Wayfair cutting board. It really is kind of a cool pattern, without all of the trouble of a lot of angled cuts. To prevent shifting during the glue up, I'm going to use 2 large pieces of MDF or particle board for cawls. I'm going to have to be very meticulous about the alignment of all the pieces during the process. That's a really nice bonus to using Type Bond 3 over Type Bond 2. It gives you a longer time before the bonding process starts. That characteristic is crucial to make these alignments. After the last night of glue drying and clamp removal, I'll make a few light passes through the drum sander to remove any residual glue and to completely true both sides of the board. I'll also make one last trim on each edge of the cutting board. Note that I am making extremely light cuts on each side. And after the last cut, I'll make some measurements to ensure the board is square. Even after being meticulous about my stock selection, you see that I ended up with a visible blemish. While I hate when it happens, a lot of times it can't be avoided. That's the nature of wood. However, I do need to do my best to ensure that this blemish doesn't become a problem, so I'm going to dig and scrape out as much dead material as I can, then use some sawdust and glue to fill the void. This process had to be repeated a couple of times. As this cutting board is quite a bit thicker than most of my cutting boards, I wanted to provide an easy way to grip it. I opted for a 45-degree chamfer on each side of the bottom edge. After setting the table saw and deciding the depth of the 45-degree cut, I make the two long side cuts and then adjust the fence and make the 45-degree cuts on the sides. And that blemish rears its ugly head again. Time to repeat the clean and fill process. Now comes the sanding. So that I know that I've fully covered the entire surface of the cutting board during sanding, I like to pencil a pattern back and forth. Once the pencil marks are gone, I know I've sanded it completely. As with all of my cutting boards, I start with 100 grit and progress with 180, 240, and 320 grits. I lightly spray the entire cutting board with water in between each grit to raise the wood grain, and then I let it fully dry before proceeding to the next grit. Before the last round of sanding, I take the board over to my CNC machine. There, I laser burn my logo onto the bottom of the cutting board. Now I can perform the last round of sanding. And now the setup for the payoff. The oil bath that brings out the color and grain of the wood. We'll let this soak for an hour or so, then drip dry overnight. The last process is to condition this board. I'm using a board wax that's in a fairly solid form. To melt the wax, I'm going to use my heat gun, which will also release some of the oils and should help them penetrate into the wood easier. Overall, I think this is one of my favorite parts when making a cutting board. And as I'm not adding feet to this particular board due to the 45-degree bevel on the bottom, this board is done and ready for its owner. Some closing thoughts on this board versus the Wayfair cutting board. I only have $30 to $40 of actual wood in this project, and my labor time for this board was fairly minimal. I'm going to estimate 4 or 5 actual hours. I don't include glue drying time in those estimates, so the total cost of this board is far below the $395 asking price on their website. Plus, I got a pretty cool design to add to my others. If you like this board design and the video, please give it a like. Comments are always welcome, and I do try to reply to everyone. As always, thanks for watching.